Dax, thank you so much for agreeing to give us up some of your time on this Wednesday morning. Really appreciate you coming on the show.
Good to be here, Charlie. Thank you for the invitation.
Top man. And I did just mention, I'm gonna draw attention to it again. The fact that we have polar bears in the background of the shot here today is a new stage for the responsible edge, and one that I think will be encouraging. So yeah, thank you for putting
as
together.
I said, Charlie, subtle as a hammer. Yeah.
Well, let's pry into that then a little bit, Dax, because as you know, the first part of the show is to really shine a light on you and get a bit sort of nostalgic about perhaps, you know, the career path that you've taken. You've obviously done a great deal in your career, which means 20 minutes is never going to be enough. But could you maybe just give us a flavor, starting perhaps at the beginning of your career path, the decisions that you've made, and perhaps what the considerations around sustainable and responsible and ethical business practice, like how those have influenced the decisions that you've made about what you've done?
Yeah. I mean, as a youngster, I was lucky enough just after school to just do a trip to Southern Africa and go on safari. And it was just amazing, you know, just to see that wildlife, and it just stays with you. It never leaves you. But I didn't sort of go into business straight away along those lines. I was just doing sales, marketing, consultancy in various sectors. And then I just thought, actually, I really need to try and marry up what I'm passionate about with what I'm doing every day. And in 2002, the sustainability conference in Johannesburg was the huge thing on the world stage. And I was working for a communications agency, and some of the businesses there were starting to sort of shine a light on what they were doing in terms of being a more responsible business. And so 23 years later, I'm still doing that. And after that communications agency, I sort of left. I went back to college at 30 years old to do a master's, which was, you know, to go back into textbooks at 30 years old is quite difficult. And I did my master's, and then I just thought I want to work for a big NGO, a big. Actually, at the time, I was thinking either a green group or a social development group, and I went for WWF, and I did 10 years at WWF, advising companies actually back then on sustainability or corporate responsibility as it was back then. So yeah, WWF is just a great grounding in this space.
Dax, I thank you for giving initial kind of flavor and introduction. I've got to go back to your heading back to college at the age of 30. What was it that you did back in higher education at that point?
I did a master's in sustainable development, and it wasn't. I mean, we covered climate change and nature, but actually, it was very much more social development orientated, and we learned about the IMF, the WTO, the World Bank, and how the policies of those big institutions, what the relationship was between the rich North and the poorer global South, and whether those policies were benefiting the South or not. And it was very development orientated. So that was just very good for me, because I thought, well, I need to think about participatory development, how people should participate in their own destiny. It's not about white Westerners thinking what they think should happen and that be imposed. It was about the global South and enabling people to be champions of their own destiny. But then I went into the green group of WWF, and so that combination of nature and what companies should do in climate change and nature, as also thinking about how people need to be involved, especially people in the poorer South. It was just a really good combination for me. Yeah.
And is that, and sorry, Dax, if I'm asking you to repeat yourself, but when you refer to the 10 years that you spent at WWF giving you a really good grounding, like explain that to us. Like what was that grounding? What was that the baseline, the foundation that offered you?
Yeah, WWF, the World Wildlife Fund. I mean, everyone thinks they're saving pandas and tigers and polar bears, and they are. But to save those incredible species, those animals, you've got to think about the habitats they live in and what are the threats to those habitats. So for the tigers, it's deforestation. So if you're sourcing palm oil and you know that is a threat to the tiger's habitat. If you're pumping out CO2 and polluting the atmosphere, that thins the ice in the Arctic and threatens the hunting ground of the polar bear. So actually, we had an incredible base of people, experts, to go and advise business. So when Marks and Spencer's developed its Plan A, one of the most respected sustainability plans around, they came to us and said, well, help us out. And so I could spin it around the organization, the climate experts, the foresters, the marine biologists, the water stewardship experts, freshwater stewardship. And together, collectively, we had this incredible brain to go back to a business and say, well, here's how you improve your plan. Here's the holes in your plan. Here's how you plug the gaps. So we just had this collective intelligence of different specialists that is quite unique. And even today, WWF will go into businesses and say, you know, you're missing something on chemicals or forests or pollution or whatever it is. So yeah, it's like an academy. Lots of my ex-colleagues are now in business.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense in terms of, yeah, I love that collective brain analogy as well. That's a brilliant analogy for what WWF is able to offer. Let me ask you though, you came from an initially a comms background. You then obviously went back to higher education, did your further learning in sustainability. Within WWF, what was your role? Like, what were you doing, and how did your comms experience, if you like, facilitate or support the work that you were now doing, I presume, in the sustainability arena?
Well, I at WWF, I went straight into strategy, and I was leading the WWF strategy on how were we to engage business. And if you think about all the different sectors, whether it's energy or retail or fast-moving consumer goods, for each different sector, there's so many different issues, and also the journeys are very different. So how do you work out when could you partner with a company in a particular sector, and how should you partner, and what should be the main issues? And then on the other side of things, when would you decide not to partner with a company and to campaign against that company and or sector? And what would the issues be that you would be the basis of the campaign? So for the energy sector, oil and gas, we engaged the oil and gas sector for across the 10 years I was there. And the decision almost unanimously across WWF was, this is not a sector we can really constructively partner with. We need to do some campaigns and wake them up and try and get the sector moving in a different direction before we would consider partnership. Whereas in the food sector, there were many big companies who were starting to understand the issues and understand what needed to be done. And we could then partner to accelerate that kind of learning, that journey in sustainability in the food sector. So it was working out when to campaign against, when to partner with, and how to do each thing intelligently.
And Dax, I almost feel like I know I've only got 45 minutes of your time, so I'm going to try and pack all this in. But out of interest, that's fascinating that was part of your remit and your role of being, I'm going to use a phrase, judge or jury, if you like, over who ultimately, WWF decided to partner with versus, as you say, kind of campaign against. What was it intent? I know it's going to be multifaceted and complex, but can you just give us a flavor as to, like, what was it that ultimately you used as your criteria to determine who you did or didn't support versus campaign against? You mentioned intention there. Like, what were the other factors?
Well, it was a change agenda. I mean, of course, we were raising funds, so money was definitely part of it. We were trying to raise the profile of particular issues to create a better understanding of climate change, the nature crisis, deforestation, those sorts of things as well. So it was the change agenda. So in the food sector, for example, when we were talking to various large businesses in that sector, we would really focus on the big impact areas. And if you can imagine the commodities like palm oil and soy and cocoa and beef, those are high impact things, aren't they? They can have a devastating impact on local habitats if they are sourced in irresponsible ways. When they're sourced in responsible ways, they can actually serve to protect forests rather than degrade them. So in the food sector, you would normally, sustainable sourcing would be a massive priority. And if a business was going to step up with sourcing fish from the Marine Stewardship Council certified sources in the oceans, then that would be a win. If it was going to source soy and palm oil and more from certified sources, you would start to warm to that business. And back then, we were on the consumption side, we were starting to talk about sustainable diet, sustainable consumption. What does a sustainable diet look like? And that was a tough gig. So you can start to imagine what were the pieces in the jigsaw puzzle that were going to make a special partnership that was change making. And so that was always the dream, to make a change making partnership based on big issues, big opportunities.
Fascinating. And just in terms of the timing of this, if I'm understanding it correctly, we're talking kind of the sort of early to late 2000s. Is that the kind of time scale we're looking at here?
Yes, we're my history's we're talking to up to about 2010. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
From 2003 to about 2013 ish. So back then, it was kind of corporate responsibility. Sustainability, as you know, was not particularly well understood.
But it was, yeah, it's a fascinating. I'm going to ask you, I want to go through obviously what happens next. But I do want to have a broader reflection on, it's obviously speaking to somebody like yourself and looking at the fact that you've literally like operated, if you like, in this space through all of those evolutions and iterations from almost the very beginning of the agenda, when it wasn't even, as you say, named sustainability. I really want to get your reflection on that overall. But let's go dive back in and go, right, WWF, you do 10 years there, as you say, this really solid foundation, this experience of of working within the strategic side of things. What do you do next?
Well, I went to Kingfisher, and Kingfisher, not the beer, not the airline, but the home improvement firm. Mm-hmm. So Kingfisher owns B&Q and Screwfix, whereas in Europe it is Brico Depot and Castorama. So it's like the Home Depot of Europe. It's one of the biggest. It is the biggest DIY home improvement operator in Europe. Mm-hmm. And the reason I went there, just a quick rapid history lesson, is first of all, corporate responsibility was about companies doing nice things here and there. Then came kind of corporate sustainability, which applied a bit more science to it, a bit more context. And then came a kind of concept of net positive. Well, actually, sustainability is still about doing no harm. Mm-hmm. It's damage control. Whereas net positive is about companies aspiring to do good and have positive impacts. And Ian Cheshire, who was the chief exec of Kingfisher at the time, had the vision of going forest positive for Kingfisher, because in your homes, in our homes, DIY, you can imagine huge amounts of timber being used, which will have an impact on forests. So to have a dream of going forest positive while running a successful business, that is a very attractive ambition. That's leadership. So the idea was I was going to join Kingfisher, and did join Kingfisher, to join that, making that dream a reality.
And out of interest, Dax, just getting into your thinking, if you like, at this point in your career. What was it a sense of, I've done 10 years at WWF, I've really understood, some practical, real world applications of how this stuff can work. I now have this opportunity at Kingfisher to go and do something that goes beyond essentially anything that I'm perhaps done before within the corporate sustainability space. And as you've alluded to, get to do something that perhaps could have a net positive impact from a commercial perspective. Am I oversimplifying it, or was that part of your thinking?
No, that's definitely true. And I think at WWF, you do drive practical change. I mean, mm-hmm. You are working with all kinds of companies in all kinds of sectors in very practical ways. And WWF has made a major contribution to how companies have moved forward. So that was being done. But then to go and go back inside a big business and take all your learnings and apply it in business. And there were colleagues in sustainability as well that I was working with in Kingfisher. Then sometimes going back inside and just facing the realities of how a company is run. And you know the fierce realities of what marketing people think about, and what procurement people think about, and what the finance director thinks about. You do need to experience that again. And so it's very useful to take all that sustainability learning and the science of climate change and nature and involving people at a participatory level, and then going back to how you talk to a finance director. I mean, you're talking different languages, and so again, you learn how to try and meet in the middle with departments.
And Dax, I know we're going to come on to talk about this when we get into the kind of the articles element of our conversation, but you mentioned there the role of and I'm sorry, I forget your colleague's name, who was the CEO of Kingfisher at the time.
Ian Cheshire, Sir Ian Cheshire.
Sir Ian Cheshire. But what was it? Presumably you had that slight, I'm putting words in your mouth here, but nervousness, if you like, about what you've just described. Like, I'm going back into a commercial context, like I'm engaging with these different departments who have got perhaps different agendas. What role did the leadership of Kingfisher have in both convincing you to ultimately join the company and look to achieve this outcome? And secondly, in terms of how it actually played out with realizing this net positive result?
Well, with Kingfisher and with Ian Cheshire, you had the vision, you had the leadership. And actually, if you go look at today, we've lost a few of those business leaders who are also leaders in sustainability. There's not many around. Mm-hmm. And Ian Cheshire was one of the few that back then was talking up the need to be more sustainable. So the leadership and the vision was there. And so that was very attractive for me. Then going into Kingfisher, they had sort of a good sustainability plan to make it more, to make the forest positive vision implemented in a real way, to see in the next 10 years how Kingfisher was going to go forest positive and what was the business model for going forest positive, because you can't just pay for it as a company yourself, you go bust. That was the interesting challenge. And so, there was some good progress made. I still don't think Kingfisher today has cracked the forest positive business model. Mm. And so I think I was sort of part of the team who helped move things forward. And that's all you can really expect to do to achieve, really. You're dealing with huge companies and fierce commercial day-to-day realities. So if you can sort of take a vision and leadership and put it partly into practice and move it the company partly further forward, that's all you can hope for.
And so let's dive into what happens next again from that point onwards. So you, how long were you at Kingfisher?
2 years.
2 years. Okay. And then, can you give us just a flavor of your mindset at the time and what led you to the next decision in terms of your career path?
Well, I've always worked in a variety of sectors. I always enjoy a variety of sectors. So I still, even today, work with various business sectors. So I actually went into fashion. I moved into Swarovski, which is crystal making, a very strange business. You wouldn't normally think, what sustainability in crystal making, but it's a magical company that makes crystal in Austria. And then it makes finished jewelry in Asia, where it owns facilities in Thailand and Vietnam. So you've got crystal making in the magical sort of mountain sort of spaces of Austria, the Alps. And then you've got jewelry making in Vietnam and Thailand. So that's
very James Bond, doesn't it, Dax?
Well, it does. It's very glamorous. I mean, in home improvement, I am useless at DIY. There was no glamour whatsoever. So to go from DIY to massive glamour was quite exciting. And we got to Davos and we were, just promoting the idea that you can have sustainable fashion, even though it sounds ludicrous. It can go in that direction when you get things right. And crystal making is, it's reasonably inert. Crystals, if they end up in waste, which doesn't really happen, it's a fairly inert material. And so we were just trying to take crystal making to the next level and associate Swarovski crystal with sustainability. And so it was good fun, and lots of challenges, and it was business to business, business to consumer, lots of different departments, lots of Austrian traditions that you were sort of encountering, and, trying to pull it together and put a plan together and move forward.
And this is, and again, I'm timelining this because I think it is particularly interesting for when we do a reflection at the end. So we're what are we, 2012, 2013?
We're now at. I wish you hadn't asked me these years because
So don't worry, we can edit it out.
We're talking about 2015-ish.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And then next, and then what happens after?
And then I stayed in fashion, and I went to Capri Holdings, and I worked for two sister companies, Versace and Jimmy Choo. Again, incredibly glamorous and very fantastic leadership and support from the top. Versace, Jimmy Choo wanted to go faster in sustainability, and so they brought me on board, and we set up a fantastic plan, and we were looking at some clear priorities. So we looked at climate change, we looked at how do you make products more responsible, we looked at the circular economy, we looked at diversity and inclusion, we looked at ethical treatment of people in the supply chain, taking that journey further forward, treating them even better. And we set up this great framework with these clear priorities, and then in each priority we set up the governance and the practical plan. And fashion is, it's got huge problems, as we all know, and it's still got huge problems and a long way to go. But again, shifting those companies further forward was a great experience, and a great set of colleagues, very good leaders, and the plan was left for them to carry on with.
And by this point in your career, Dax, are you sort of, from what you're describing, it sounds to me like you're almost having these opportunities to go into these different sectors that at the sort of, I'm not going to call it pioneering, but well, in fact, maybe it is pioneering, but you're going in early, aren't you? And you're getting an opportunity to work on, genuinely kind of impactful strategic plans, etc., for these organizations. And then it sounds like you then sort of hand over the baton a little bit within these organizations, say, well, look, we now have the plan in place, it's over to you guys to implement. Is that kind of what you realized you were starting to sort of do in terms of your career and want to do? Was that the exciting bit for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a good chief sustainability officer tries to do themselves out of a job.
Okay.
But it takes a long time to do that, because you've got to set out the priorities. You've got to get buy-in from the board, from C-suite. You then got to cascade it in across the whole business, so that every department, every head of department is involved and understands what the plan is and takes ownership of it. And they start to own projects, they start to roadmap projects and implement them with your guidance. And then when things are up and running, you can move on. And that is the dream. And it sometimes works out and sometimes it doesn't.
Let's go through the rest of, so we're at Jimmy Choo, Versace. What happens next?
Well, I'm now in consultancy. So I've gone back to the variety of sectors, similar to what I did at WWF, but obviously in a much more commercial environment now, and also in a much more mature environment, because sustainability has to be married up with, the commerce, the commercial aspects. And so, back to a variety of energy companies, food companies, fashion companies, retail, fast-moving consumer goods. I'm back in that sort of environment, supporting those kinds of companies move on. And recently I worked with a whiskey maker in Scotland. And the thing about whiskey is you grow, it comes from barley growing. So how do you make regenerative agriculture? How can you make barley growing team up with regenerative agriculture, which is the latest buzzword, and you become a nature positive business by growing barley in a regenerative way, if that is possible. So that was one example recently of trying to put together, helping a company with a strategy on that and implementing that and moving them towards regenerative agriculture in a slow but sure fashion.
I love that. Okay. Well, we've done the classic thing, Dax, of like, it was, and I knew this was going to happen with you, but basically we're 25 minutes in, etc., into the conversation. But I've still got questions about you, so I'm going to press on. We might not get to the article, in all honesty, but let's press on. So, looking at your career and looking at the experience that you've had, the 23 years as you've described it, like, can you just provide us with some reflections from your perspective about how you see and I'm going to call it for simplicity, the sustainability agenda. Like, how has that evolved over that time? And from your perspective, like, what's your state of mind when it comes to optimism versus despair? Like, where are you at now that you've got this body of work and experience under your belt?
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. I mean, there's good and bad, isn't there? As always, the good is sustainability is so much better understood now than when I started, and to get the majority of businesses recognizing sustainability as a real business priority, back when I started, was very, very difficult. And to get the media talking about sustainability and climate change in business was very, very difficult. And now it's all changed. Most large companies, a lot of small companies have sustainability departments, heads of sustainability. So the good news is the majority of business takes this seriously now. And that is good news. And they've started to apply the science much more than they ever did. It's not about corporate responsibility, nice things here and there. It's about applying science to understand, companies are doing materiality assessments, science-based assessments to understand what are the biggest impacts and opportunities in the social and environmental spaces. What are the big areas of focus and what do you do about it? And so that's the good news. The bad news is we've slightly sunk back into compliance. There's various regulations coming up on reporting and due diligence, which is good news because it's shoving everyone forward, but it ties everyone up, and companies have small teams. So if all of your bandwidth is now complying with upcoming due diligence and reporting regulations, that is a bit of a sort of a negative, because you're not leading or innovating as much as people thought about before. And the second negative thing is that there has been this ESG backlash. So many, you, Charlie, and your viewers would have read some things about Unilever, perhaps. And Unilever's been under fire recently, in recent years, for being too sustainability focused, too focused on purpose, social purpose, and not focusing enough on the business, which is a complete ridiculous way of putting it. Sustainability is still fundamental to a successful business, to running a successful business. And yet the recent chief exec of Unilever has perhaps succumbed to that pressure, that anti-ESG feeling amongst some activist investors who aren't particularly enlightened and think about short-termism. So there's this compliance agenda, which is tying everyone up. There's this ESG backlash in the States and in the UK, and let's say anti-woke agenda, and the net zero has become a dirty words now in the Telegraph and the Daily Mail. So that has created a bit of an ESG backlash, and some companies are sort of bowing to that pressure, and others are staying the course and thinking, no, this is still, we've got to stay with this. There is no other option.
And I've got two questions. The first one, I want to go back to your first point regarding compliance, and I'm going to call it like compliance versus innovation. Like that's the question that we've posed to other guests. So with thinking back through, your time with Kingfisher, and then equally your time with Jimmy Choo and Versace, and I forget, sorry, the crystal company's name. Were you while you were engaging with those companies, was there very much a sense that this was about innovation and this wasn't necessarily about the tick box compliance exercises? Was there a feeling for you in terms of the remit that you had, that it was about how do we make this business ultimately more sustainable, not how do we successfully report on what we're doing? Or is that an oversimplification of things?
No, it's right. I mean, throughout my 23 years of doing this, whether it was WWF or afterwards, there's always this balance of ambition versus, I don't know if being realistic is the right word, but ambition versus what is practically achievable.
Yeah.
And when you are an advisor or you're trying to push the sustainability agenda, you're talking to someone at the other end of the table. They might be a finance director, they might be head of procurement, they might be head of omnichannel. And you're always looking for those glimmers, those sparkles of leadership. And that person, whoever it is you're talking to, hopefully is a little bit on your page, and they're thinking, yeah, we can do more. We can innovate. But very often you're facing pushback. You know, we can't do that. We can't do all those things you want to do. We can do it, but we can't do it now. We're not doing that right now. We're doing it in the future. So there's mostly pushback you're facing, and you've got to navigate around that pushback and say, come on, there are a couple of things we could really push forward on. Yes, we could park a few other things. So it's a negotiation. I mean, it's always been a negotiation. You're trying to get a balance of real ambition and leadership versus, you know, the day-to-day realities that any large company is facing. And it's been a tough trading environment in recent years, hasn't it, for various reasons, the reasons we always hear about in the news. So, you know, realism versus ambition, it's always a balancing act. And I always think, look, leadership ambition will actually pay back if you want to remain a relevant business. So get ambitious. But yes, we can't do everything at once. Let's put a practical plan together.
And Dax, I think before we recorded, you actually shared, I think, a couple of recent examples of where I'm gonna use the term, I guess, weak leadership has essentially facilitated some less than positive outcomes when it comes to, again, broadly sustainability issues. Can you maybe just touch upon perhaps those couple of examples and just dissect for us, like, where you think things went wrong in terms of the leadership function?
Where it went wrong, I mean,
I'm referring to Next and the Jack Daniels examples.
Oh, okay. Well, a good friend of mine, Andrew Winston, who works on sustainability in the US, he highlighted to me there is a particular activist right now who is very anti-woke and anti-diversity and inclusion, and he has got a campaign targeting various brands who have made very public commitments to do good things on diversity and inclusion. And unfortunately, I think Jack Daniels is one of the brands that seems to have bowed to this pressure, rolled back on DEI, and is backtracking from some of its DEI commitments because of this one-man campaign that's going on. And I think Harley Davidson is another one in the news that has been reported to have rolled back on DEI commitments. So this is part of the anti-woke campaign that we see in the US, in the UK, in parts of Europe now, and it's very, very sad because it's giving D&I a bad name. And all diversity and inclusion is doing, and it often is quite clumsy, unfortunately, because we're all trying to find our way through this very messy grey area, and we're trying to do the right things, and we often do it in a clumsy way, and that's creating a bit of a backlash. So I think companies who are looking at that are thinking, well, where do we go now? And you know, they've got to stay the course because D&I is so important. If you have a very diverse management team, a very diverse workforce, and if you reflect your very diverse customer base, you're going to be a stronger business, and you're going to avoid that kind of groupthink of you know, that sometimes happens. You want a diverse, rich sense of ideas and people in your business to come up with new great ideas, and that diversity serves you well. So we can't give up on D&I. We've got to carry on with it, and it's just got to be done in better, stronger ways and meaningful ways. No one wants to do things for the sake of things. We want them to make a difference. We want to be tolerant and kind towards all people around us. And unfortunately, this campaign in the US is starting to have an impact on some companies. But I think other companies are rejecting that anti-woke campaign.
And Dax, if we look into and we pry into the role of leadership and within this context, like, what does strong leadership within the realms of sustainability look like? You've had a close, you know, working relationships with, you know, in Fisher, etc. at Kingfisher.
Yeah.
So just explain to us, like, is it simply just about once the course is set, staying absolutely consistent and aligned with that course and not bowing to, you know, the pressures of the kind of you know, the open dialogue and criticism that can come within the kind of digital world that we live in? Or, you know, what are the other things that look like strong leadership to you?
Well, so we've talked a little bit about DEI. If we look at another area, big area of sustainability, it's the circular economy, isn't it? And in the circular economy, if you look at each different sector, whether it's fashion or retail or FMCG or furnishings, furniture, you know, we're scratching the surface of circular business models. We're still a very wasteful society. As business, we produce things rapidly. As a consumer, we buy things and throw things away. And that's a huge problem, and it's starting to be addressed. And the Ellen MacArthur Foundation has done fantastic work to raise the profile of this wastefulness and the opportunity of moving into circularity. But we're still scratching the surface of it. And the fashion sector is starting to wake up to this. And a lot of fashion players now are starting slowly to move into the secondhand market. But one leader, I think, Charlie, you and I have talked about, is IKEA. And IKEA has recognized, first of all, that it needs to innovate because conventional retailing is sort of somewhat failing. You know, its big out-of-town stores now are much less popular than they were. Its products are already sold on the open market secondhand, whether IKEA likes it or not. So in response, IKEA has now set up its own secondhand platform. So it now provides its own managed experience for its customers on care, repair, and resale on secondhand furniture. So that's fantastic. So, and what the chief exec has said is the reason it's doing that is because it's good for circularity, it's good for the customer, it's better customer service, but they also want to be the main go-to destination for home furnishings. Mm-hmm. So it's fascinating. What it says is, look, we're not just doing a secondhand platform for the sake of it to look good. We want to be the go-to destination. So that's fundamental to business. And you just think, wow, what a vision. It's perfectly aligned: business, sustainability, circularity. And then another one is Currys, the electronics provider. Currys has got one of the largest repair centers in Europe. So it takes back devices and repairs them and sells them back into the customer base. And one quote I saw was, it makes more profit on a refurbished mobile phone than it does on a new phone. You think, wow, okay. So we're not just talking about vision and ambition, we're talking about fundamental revenue, alternative revenue drivers. So for me, Currys IKEA, that is real leadership. They're starting to crack into circularity in a fundamental way.
And is that Dax? That's really interesting, and that's amazing about the Currys example. That's astonishing and brilliant to hear. Is it? You've used the term a few times. Is it therefore that these leaders working within these organizations, it's the ambition and the scope of vision that is the thing that is great leadership when it comes to thinking about sustainability, circularity, et cetera, and evolving business models, essentially? Is that the key, that we need visionary leaders that are truly ambitious about how they can develop and evolve their, at times, large traditional businesses? Is that the key?
Yeah, you said the magic words, Charlie, business models, because sustainability and things like the circular economy, that has to grow across the whole value chain, you know, from the supply chain to the operations of a business to how the business engages and provides goods or services to the customer. That's the value chain. And most companies are active across the value chain, but few actually fundamentally shift the business model. So IKEA and Currys are good examples of a part shift away from simply just selling stuff to providing services that can repair, care for, preserve items that can be resold, kept for longer. So that fundamental change in the business model, you know, you could imagine in the next decade that actually we see a lot of that in future. We don't just sell stuff. We get a shift from products to services that keep items in circulation. And that for me is exciting. So I think if anyone out there is trying to spot a leader, look at the business model. Have they in any way has that business shifted partly in the business model? If it hasn't, it's probably no leader. And the thing is, if you don't do that, you fail anyway. You know, Pure Innovation says blockbusters, Kodak, all those, you know, fun things on HMV, the poor souls who have sort of diminished massively, they didn't innovate, did they? And so this sustainability is fundamentally about survival in the future.
And Dax, prying into kind of the work that you're doing now with the companies that you're consulting with, is that part of the criteria for what you're looking for in terms of who you'll work with? Are you looking for that leader that has shown perhaps through the evolution of the business model, or the intention to develop the business model, perhaps working alongside you? Is that a key criteria for who you choose to work with?
It's a massive passion for me. I will work with companies in all stages of the journey. So if the company says, look, actually, we're just at the beginnings, we need a plan to start moving forward, I'm there. If someone says, actually, we want to think about massive leadership and innovation, I mean, I'm falling off my chair, and I'm really up for it, But if anyone wants to move along in the journey, that's good enough for me. If someone does want to say, look, we want to know in this sector, what are the future trends? How is AI going to impact us and our journey and our sustainability plan? What are the new business models that are going to happen? What is being disrupted in the marketplace by, and startups have this fantastic ability to come along and upend a conventional sector. So, when you're at the leadership end and at the innovation end, you're always looking at what are the startups doing? What can the large companies learn from the startups who are potentially going to disrupt them out of business unless they adapt and innovate along the lines of what the startups are doing? So, yeah, I'll work across the spectrum, but leadership is always the most exciting project.
I was gonna, you've been, Dax, you've been absolutely one of the most amazing guests, because you've literally brought in themes that I haven't brought in, that we discussed we were going to bring in. You brought them in, which is fantastic. I want to ask you though about startups. So you've obviously, worked at a very significant scale and size of organization. If you were advising a startup founder about how they go about thinking about sustainability within their startup, within their business, like what would be the key things that you think are applicable at the kind of startup stage that you've worked on at the much larger enterprise level?
I mean, if you're a startup that's off the ground, you kind of already decided what your business is about, haven't you? So I think at the basic level, I would just say, start to carry out a bit of an assessment of where do you think the biggest sustainability impacts of your business is, and also opportunities, and how can you pursue those. And you might think, as I said before, about climate change, about nature, about circularity, about ethical treatment of people in the supply chain, and diversity and inclusion. And those are 5 areas that are reasonably core to many sectors. So that's one thing. If you're a startup that hasn't quite fully formed, I would say, in terms of what your business is going to be about, try and think about what are the massive societal needs right now. Can you generate huge carbon savings in some way? Can you drive renewables and clean tech forward? Can you drive circularity and the second-hand market forward in some huge way? What are the big things that you always see in the news that are in desperate need of solving, whether it's the water crisis or plastic pollution? Can your startup attack some of those areas? Because it's gold dust. I mean, if you think about the Impossible Burger, those things that suddenly arrived on the scene where they displaced meat burgers because the taste was actually pretty good. You thought, where did that come from? And my God, they're making huge amounts. I mean, there's a slight backlash now because it's quite ultra processed, isn't it? And so they need to rethink and rejig that. But there's these startups that appear and disruptions that appear that can be hugely lucrative.
I feel like I'm jumping around a little bit, but that's only because we're getting towards the end of our time on this episode. Dax, I want to I've got 2 final questions. The first one, before I asked you kind of for your sort of review of the state of play, and you gave us essentially 1 good and 2 bad in terms of essentially the way that you're viewing the sustainability agenda as it is. Can I ask you for your kind of magic 8 ball kind of vision for the future, like looking ahead, are you overarchingly hopeful about the direction we're heading in? Or, I mean, what's your ultimate perspective upon where we're going collectively as a society when it comes to, you know, the sustainability issues at play?
I mean, a lot of people talk about this optimism and pessimism, and a lot of people talk about oscillating between the two. And I don't know. I try and avoid that because you can be so up and down. I mean, the dream in future is to eliminate. Because I knew you were going to hit me with this question, so I was trying to think about it. But trying to eliminate externalities.
Mm-hmm.
What with the vision, the dream is that any company and any government will help this. Any product you buy, what should be priced in is all of the social and environmental costs of making that product or providing that service, whatever it might be. We have to try and eliminate externality. So if that product or the service in its delivery is creating pollution somewhere, it needs to be cleaned up. So if you're buying a plastic riddled product, surely you recognize that I am buying a plastic riddled product. Someone needs to pay for the cleanup of this eventually. I should be paying that in when I pay for that product. Mm-hmm. Or livable wages. I mean, there's a big thing in Iceland, the retailer right now, where the boss is saying we can't raise the minimum wage. I mean, for goodness sake, people need a livable wage in this cost of living crisis. If I go to shop in Iceland and I'm buying something, I want to buy something and feel that when I bought it, the person who's helped make that product and delivered it to me, they're getting a livable wage. You know, they've got a decent working life because they've done the good thing of made this product that I'm consuming. So that's the dream.
So and you've again, you've done it for a third time, which is absolutely, Dax, you're definitely the most the most sort of aware of show format guest we've ever had. The final question that we do ask is the magic wand question. I feel like you might have already alluded to it, but you know, with that magic wand, if you could change one thing about the corporate world right this instance, what would that one thing be? And I'm going to ask the question, then we'll almost begin to answer it. From what you've just described there, I think almost you're suggesting that actually a collective consciousness that we as consumers could adopt or have of realization of, you know, the role and what's at play when I am engaging and purchasing a product in terms of environmental and social externalities, as you've alluded to. Is that in your mind? Would that shift the dial? Would that be the thing to change overnight?
Yeah, I think governments, businesses, and customers have to work together. Let's just acknowledge and understand and teach each other what are the problems with making that product. Can those problems be addressed? Mm-hmm. If I am buying a diesel car, I pretty much know that it's not good for the environment. It's quite polluting. I should know in myself, with all the news around now, and businesses who are starting to talk about these issues, I should know that diesel car is not great for people around me and the environment. So I should consider, even if I'm struggling to afford changing my car, I need to think, how do I do that to move to a better thing? And how can the providers of such products make it easier for me? So the dream is do no harm when I'm consuming a product or when I'm, as a business, making a product. Do no harm. But the other thing is go positive. I mean, why shouldn't we provide services and products in a way that creates positive impacts for the people who are making those things, or for the environment, the natural resources that are required to be going into that product? How can I go forest positive in a real sense? So do no harm, but actually go positive and think about leadership and innovation. And another example is Octopus Energy. I mean, they're going with heat pumps, they're going with clean tech, they want more renewables in wind farms and so on. They want to support people who live next to wind farms. They also provide a lot of charging infrastructure for electric vehicles, or charging sort of pay schemes. You know, that is another visionary leader. So do no harm, go positive, be an innovative leader.
What a perfect way to conclude, Dax. I feel like a real call to arms on that front. That has been an absolute whistle-stop tour of your career and thoughts on some of these sustainability issues that we have at play. Thank you so much for joining us for this morning's episode, Dax. It's been absolutely brilliant to have you on. Hopefully you've enjoyed it yourself, and we might be able to snaffle you for another episode at some point. But thank you for coming.
I've loved it, Charlie. Thank you so much for having me on. And actually, I really enjoyed the conversation. I think you really get to the issues, which is it actually is quite unusual in this day to have this proper discussion. So thank you very much.